Welcome back, everyone. I am Mr. Sleep Crime, and tonight we continue our exploration of one of the most unsettling and mysterious crimes in Japan's history, the Setagaya family murder. A crime that occurred over 2 decades ago remains unsolved to this day. The crime was brutal, the investigation haunting, and the questions that remain have only deepened with time. Why did this happen? Who could commit such an atrocious act? And why has the killer never been caught? But what makes this case stand out and why it remains a true crime enigma is the chilling nature of the crime itself. A family, a quiet suburban neighborhood, and a killer who disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only fragments of clues that have failed to connect to any known suspect. What happened that night in the home of the Miyazawa family, and more importantly, who did it? Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Let me know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below with your location and time zone, and let me know how far this tale has traveled. It's fascinating to see how these stories resonate across the world, and it's incredible to connect with so many of you. As we uncover the pieces of this haunting case, I want you to think, how can a killer leave behind so many clues, yet remain undetected? The Setagaya family murder is one of Japan's greatest unsolved mysteries. Let's dive deeper. December 30th, 2000. A cold, silent night in the Setagaya district of Tokyo. The wind howled through the trees, creating eerie whispers through the branches. It was the kind of night where the peacefulness of a suburban neighborhood seemed to stretch for miles, untouched by the violence that would soon shatter its calm. For most of the people who lived there, it was just another evening, preparing for the upcoming New Year's celebrations. But inside the Miyazawa household, everything was about to change forever. Father Tatsuo, Mother Mitsuko, and their 2 children, Nina, 8, and Rei, 6, were preparing for a quiet night in. They had no idea that the peaceful tranquility of their home was about to be shattered. They were unaware that a shadow had already entered their lives, a shadow that would extinguish their light forever. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, the Miyazawas went about their evening routines. They were looking forward to welcoming the new year with the typical warmth of a family gathering, with laughter and joy filling the air. But out there, in the cold and dark streets of Setagaya, a killer was closing in. The attack was premeditated, calculated, and swift. The killer knew what they were doing. They knew exactly when the family would be most vulnerable, and they knew the house well enough to avoid detection. The family's door was unlocked, perhaps a small detail, but one that would later haunt the investigation. The family dog, a Shiba Inu, lay peacefully by the door, unaware of the danger approaching. The door creaked softly as it opened. The killer stepped into the house undetected. They had planned this meticulously. They had waited for the perfect opportunity, and now it was time to strike. His first victim was Mitsuko, the mother. In the darkness of her room, while she lay peacefully in her bed, the killer struck. The blows were swift, calculated. Mitsuko never had a chance to fight back. She was killed with stabbing motions, the weapon a blade pressed deep into her body. The violence was over in a matter of moments. Next came Tatsuo, the father. He was attacked in a similar fashion. There was no mercy. His life was ripped away in a matter of seconds. But this wasn't just an ordinary attack. The precision, the methodical nature of the killing indicated that this was not the work of a random intruder. This was someone who had planned this, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. After killing the parents, the killer moved on to Nina and Ray, the young children. They were in their beds, fast asleep, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. But just like their parents, they were victims of the killer's brutality. The killer did not hesitate. Nina and Ray, both innocent, had their lives taken away in an instant. The manner in which the children were killed was as brutal and cold as the murders of the parents. There were no signs of a struggle. It was as if they were taken by surprise, as if they knew the killer. The house was quiet, the only sound being the cold wind outside, rustling the leaves. In an instant, everything changed. The attack was so swift, so violent, that there was no time for anyone to react. The killer showed no mercy, no emotion. They executed the family in cold blood, each blow deliberate. The crime was not just brutal, it was calculated. It was a message. But what was the message? Why this family? And why such a violent act? What makes this case even more chilling is what happened after the murders. The killer didn't immediately flee the scene. They didn't panic. No, the killer stayed. They lingered in the house as if the murders were just a part of their plan. The killer didn't rush. They didn't fear being caught. Instead, they made themselves comfortable. They ate food from the family's refrigerator as if they were at home, as if this was just another evening. The family's kitchen, once a place of warmth, became a place of cold indifference. The killer took their time. What was most disturbing, however, was the killer's use of the family's computer. After the murders, the killer sat down at the computer and began searching the internet. What were they searching for? Why spend time after such a horrific act, browsing websites with obscure and seemingly random terms? These were not searches that would lead to answers. They were meaningless, yet they added to the sense of unease that surrounded the crime. The killer even washed their hands and cleaned up a bit before leaving the scene. There was no rush, no panic. The killer took their time and left the scene undisturbed, except for the evidence they had left behind: footprints, fingerprints, and DNA. After several hours, the killer simply walked away. The next morning, Tatsuo's mother arrived, expecting to celebrate the holidays with her family. What she found was a scene of unimaginable horror. She stepped into the house and was met with silence. As she moved through the rooms, her eyes were met with the lifeless bodies of the family she loved, 4 bodies scattered throughout the house. Mitsuko, Tatsuo, Nina, and Ray, each of them taken in a way that defied comprehension. The house was drenched in blood, a crime scene that defied all logic. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of self-defense. It was as if the killer had complete control over the situation. The killer had come and gone, leaving behind only silence and death. The police arrived at the scene quickly. They combed through the house, examining every inch for clues. But what they found was as perplexing as the crime itself. There was no forced entry into the home. The door had been unlocked, and there was no sign that anyone had been startled or alarmed. The family's dog, the only living witness, remained calm, its behavior strange for a dog that would usually react to an intruder. The lack of forced entry raised suspicions. Was this a random act of violence? Or did the killer know the family? The lack of struggle suggested that the family might have known the attacker. It was as if they had been taken by surprise, as if they had no reason to fear the intruder. The bloodied footprints left at the scene were crucial evidence. They showed that the killer had injured themselves during the attack, possibly stepping in the blood of their victims. The police were able to track the footprints through the house, but they didn't lead to any solid leads. The only other evidence was DNA. The hope was that the DNA would match someone in the database. But despite the evidence, there were no answers. The DNA didn't match anyone in the police records. The investigation quickly began to stagnate. And what made the case even more frustrating was the killer's strange behavior after the murders. The killer had left behind so many clues, yet no solid evidence to point them in the right direction. As the investigation into the Setagaya family murder continued, the case seemed to spiral further into uncertainty. The police had carefully combed through the crime scene, but with no forced entry, no known suspects, and no solid leads. They were left with more questions than answers. Forensics provided valuable clues, but they didn't lead them any closer to identifying the killer. The bloodied footprints left at the scene were the most immediate piece of physical evidence. They suggested the killer had injured themselves during the attack. The footprints were traced through the house, indicating that the assailant had moved carefully, almost methodically, through the various rooms. Yet the police couldn't determine how the injury occurred. The lack of any other physical injuries or signs of a struggle made it hard to piece together the timeline. Next came the DNA. It was the most significant lead. But as the days turned into weeks, the results came back negative. There were no matches in the criminal database. The DNA was unique, belonging to someone who had never been involved with the law before. The discovery was unsettling, as it hinted at an unknown individual with no criminal record, someone who had come and gone without leaving any trace. With the investigation stagnating, the Setagaya police appealed to the public for help. They issued several public statements, hoping that anyone could come forward with information. The case was featured on the news, but despite the widespread media coverage, no significant tips came in. Time passed, and the silence from the killer only grew louder. As the case remained unsolved, several theories began to circulate. One of the first theories to emerge was that the crime was driven by revenge. Some speculated that the killer had a personal connection to the Miyazawa family. The lack of forced entry suggested that the killer had been familiar with the family's routine and access to the house. Perhaps the killer had been wronged by one of the family members in the past. However, the police quickly dismissed this theory, as there was no evidence linking the Miyazawas to any individual who would have had a motive for such an extreme act of violence. Investigators also examined the Miyazawa family's personal relationships. Mitsuko and Tatsuo were described as hardworking and well-liked by their friends and colleagues. They had no known enemies, no unresolved disputes, and their social circles appeared to be peaceful and stable. There was no sign of any past conflicts that could explain the brutal nature of the crime. Another theory was that the Setagaya family murder was the work of a serial killer, someone who had committed similar murders in the past, or someone who was starting a pattern of violence. The brutality of the attack, coupled with the methodical nature of the killer's behavior, seemed to suggest that the perpetrator might have committed other murders or would go on to commit more. The police expanded their investigation, looking for similarities between this case and other unsolved crimes across Japan. However, they found no direct connections to any known serial killer or previous murders. Despite the killer's calmness, there was no evidence linking this case to others, leaving investigators to consider that this could be an isolated act of violence, perhaps a one-off tragedy. Some experts proposed that the killer could have been a random intruder, someone who had come across the family at a vulnerable moment. This theory, while unsettling, seemed less likely given the methodical nature of the crime. The fact that the killer spent hours inside the house, eating food and using the family's computer, suggested that this was no ordinary random attack. It was a crime carefully planned out, with the killer leaving behind too many traces and clues to make it appear accidental. The emotional toll of the Setagaya family murder was immense, not only for the victims' families, but also for the community of Setagaya. The crime had shattered the peaceful image of the suburban neighborhood where families once felt safe. The Miyazawa family had been well known and respected in their community. Their sudden and brutal deaths left a profound void that could never be filled. For Tatsuo's mother, who had discovered the bodies, the trauma was unimaginable. Her grief was compounded by the horror of finding her son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren dead in their own home. She would never be able to unsee the violence that had taken place that night. The emotional scars ran deep, and while the rest of the world moved on, her life was forever marked by that single morning. The investigation took a toll on the police officers involved as well. The lack of answers, the absence of a clear suspect, created a sense of frustration and hopelessness. Detective Tetsuya Imai, who had worked the case since the beginning, spoke in interviews about how emotionally draining it was. He mentioned how, in the absence of leads, his team struggled to keep hope alive. The murder had left the entire community haunted by the question, who could do something so cruel and remain undetected? As the months passed, the case began to attract increasing attention from the media. News outlets, both in Japan and abroad, followed the developments closely, but the coverage only seemed to deepen the public's anxiety. Every new update brought fresh speculation, but no breakthrough came. The public began to feel helpless. The killer was out there, still walking free, perhaps living among them. The Miyazawa family's tragic deaths became the focus of true crime documentaries, articles, and podcasts, all of which highlighted the chilling details of the case. But even with all this attention, the killer was nowhere to be found. Years went by without any significant developments, but in 2005, the case was reopened with fresh eyes. New forensic technology promised a breakthrough. A re-examination of the DNA evidence found at the scene was conducted using advanced methods that could extract more information from the samples collected. Unfortunately, despite these advancements, the DNA did not match any new or known individuals in the system. The killer, as elusive as ever, remained an unknown entity. Despite the reopening of the case, the Setagaya murder continued to slip further into the realm of cold cases. The killer's identity remained unknown, and with each passing year, the possibility of solving the case seemed more and more unlikely. As the investigation slowed, some of the most haunting questions lingered in the minds of those who had followed the case closely. Why did the killer target the Miyazawa family? What motivated such a brutal attack? How could a killer remain undetected for so long despite leaving so many clues behind? Was the killer someone with a personal connection to the family, or a stranger who had been planning the crime for some time? The Setagaya family murder became one of the most famous cold cases in Japan. It was a story that no one could forget, a mystery that refused to be solved. The killer's identity remained unknown, and with each passing year, the possibility of solving the case seemed more and more unlikely. As the investigation slowed, some of the most haunting questions lingered in the minds of those who had followed the case closely. Why did the killer target the Miyazawa family? What motivated such a brutal attack? How could a killer remain undetected for so long, despite leaving so many clues behind? Was the killer someone with a personal connection to the family, or a stranger who had been planning the crime for some time? The Setagaya family murder became one of the most famous cold cases in Japan. It was a story that no one could forget, a mystery that refused to be solved. In the years following the murder, several new theories emerged. These were based on circumstantial evidence, witness testimonies, and profiles of other suspects who could fit the bill. Some of these theories were more plausible than others, but none had enough evidence to push the investigation toward a definitive conclusion. The stranger theory. This theory suggests that the killer was a random, unknown individual who happened to target the Miyazawa family. The theory is based on the fact that the killer had no apparent connection to the family, and that there was no known reason for the crime. The lack of forced entry and lack of connection to the victims supports this theory. The local suspect theory. Some believe that the killer was local to the Setagaya area. They argue that the perpetrator might have been familiar with the Miyazawa family's routine, and the lack of forced entry suggests that they could have been let in or had access to the house. This theory also suggests that the killer might have been watching the family for some time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The Setagaya family murder remains one of Japan's most chilling unsolved cases. The killer, despite leaving behind an array of physical evidence, has managed to evade capture for over 2 decades. The family's tragic end will forever haunt Setagaya and Japan's criminal history. As we end tonight's tale, we are reminded that some mysteries never get resolved. Some killers are never caught. The Setagaya family murder is one such mystery, one that still lingers in the dark corners of our minds, reminding us that evil can hide in plain sight. As you drift off tonight, think about the countless stories that remain untold, the cases that remain unsolved. And remember that sometimes even the most chilling stories are not meant to have an ending. Good night. Have a beautiful sleep.